The air was thick with dust. The sun beat down on the barren landscape. This was the Pashtun Tribal Area, a place where men were judged by their courage and loyalty. For generations, the Pashtun people lived by a strict code of honor. It was a land where revenge was expected, forgiveness was rare. After years of conflict, the Taliban had taken control. They imposed their own harsh interpretation of justice. The people, weary of war, accepted their rule. They longed for peace. The Taliban's word was law, their courts were swift, their punishments were brutal. But for many it was better than the chaos that came before. At least there was order. At least there was some semblance of justice. Jain Khan was a man of stories. He would weave tales of bravery and adventure. His voice, rich with the rhythm of their language, captivated his listeners. He spoke of heroes and villains, of love and loss. His words painted vivid pictures in the minds of his audience.
But my heart was heavy. A deep sadness had settled over me. My son and daughter-in-law were murdered. Their lives were cut short by a senseless act of violence. Their laughter was silenced forever.
The pain of their loss was unbearable. It choked his voice. It stole his words. The storyteller was silenced. All that remained was a father's grief and a burning desire for justice. The Taliban, known for their strict interpretation of Islamic law, had taken it upon themselves to investigate past crimes. They promised swift and decisive justice. Their methods were often harsh, but their commitment to order resonated with people desperate for peace.
When news of Jain Khan's loss reached us, we launched an investigation. We knew the importance of maintaining order in the region. We knew that unsolved crimes could lead to feuds and unrest.
The investigation was swift and brutal. The Taliban were not known for their leniency. They interrogated witnesses, gathered evidence, and followed every lead. Their pursuit of justice was relentless. The weight of their investigation bore down. It was not long before the Taliban apprehended a man named Kashai. He was a known criminal with a reputation for violence.
Under the Taliban's questioning, I confessed. I admitted to the brutal murder of Jain Khan's son and daughter-in-law.
Kashai's confession sent shockwaves through the community. The brutality of his crime was unspeakable. The Taliban, true to their word, promised swift justice. They sentenced Kashai to death. He was to be executed in public. The news of the impending execution spread like wildfire. It reached Jain Khan, who had been consumed by grief. The Taliban offered him a choice. He could exercise his right under Pashtunwali, the traditional code of honor, and carry out the execution himself. The day of the execution arrived. The air was heavy with anticipation. A hush fell over the crowd as Jain Khan made his way to the execution ground. His steps were slow, his body was stooped with grief.
I was a man broken by loss. My heart ached for my son and daughter-in-law.
He clutched the rifle in his hand. It felt heavy, foreign. He had never taken a life before. The weight of revenge was almost unbearable, but he knew what he had to do. He owed it to his family. He owed it to himself. The execution ground was a barren patch of earth. In the center stood a lone post. Kashai was dragged towards it. His face was pale. His eyes darted nervously around the crowd.
I watched as Kashai was tied to the post. I could hear the murmur of the crowd behind me. I could feel their eyes on me.
He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Each step was an effort. Each step brought him closer to the moment of truth.
My heart pounded, fear gripping my entire being.
Jain Khan raised the rifle. His hands trembled. He struggled to find his breath. The crowd held its breath. Time seemed to stand still. The first shot rang out. A collective gasp went through the crowd.
I stumbled back, shock etched on my face. I took another deep breath. I steadied myself. I would not fail my family again.
He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The second shot found its mark. Section 8. Redemption found in the echoes of justice.
Kashai slumped against the post.
Silence descended upon the crowd. The only sound was the echo of the gunshot. Jain Khan lowered the rifle. He felt a strange sense of detachment. The deed was done. Justice, as the Taliban called it, had been served. But there was no joy in his heart, no sense of triumph.
Only a deep, abiding sadness. His son and daughter-in-law were still gone, and nothing could bring them back.
Section 9. The Weight of Revenge.
Jain Khan turned and walked away from the execution ground. The crowd parted to let him pass. He walked slowly, his head bowed. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him. He had taken a life, even a life as forfeit as Kararai's. The act felt heavy on his soul.
He was a man of stories, not of violence. He had sought justice and he had found it. But at what cost? The price of revenge, he realized, was dear indeed. Section 10. A New Dawn in the Shadow of the Mountains. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the execution ground, Jain Khan disappeared into the crowd. Life under the watchful eyes of the Taliban would continue. Their brand of justice, harsh and absolute, had been served. The execution served as a stark reminder. A reminder of the Taliban's authority and their commitment to order. It was a reminder that in this land, some transgressions were unforgivable. Section 11. The Storyteller's Legacy.
Jain Khan never told stories again. His voice, once filled with laughter and adventure, remained silent. The weight of his loss and the burden of his revenge had silenced the storyteller.
But he would forever be known as the man who had faced his family's killer. The man who had sought and found a brutal, necessary justice, and in the end that was the story he left behind, a story whispered on the wind, a story that spoke of loss, justice, and the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a story that would echo through the ages, a story that would become a part of the fabric of their lives.